Hi friends, welcome to Sustainable Work. I have my friend Pete Skarzynski with me here today. Pete is a strategy consultant with years of experience as an executive in the high tech and telecom industries. With broad experience in strategy, product management, marketing, sales, mergers and acquisitions, business development, manufacturing, and operations. 20 years of experience at AT&T, started Samsung's mobile phone business in North America, becoming the first non-Korean international executive, and was with several startup operations, including Touchstone Wireless and Hala Mobile. Hi, Pete. Welcome. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I'm so happy you're here. Both Pete and I live in Dallas, so Pete is my very good friend, and we used to be neighbors, not anymore, unfortunately, but still get to see him every once in a while. So Pete, tell us, what is that you're currently doing as for work? Where do your interests lie?
Sure. So currently I'm doing a little bit of management and consulting with a company called Sounding Board Strategy. So again, the idea is to help new budding businesses develop a business plan, implementation plan, and really be a sounding board to business entrepreneurs or business executives who are just kind of looking to round out their experience. So that's what I'm doing right now.
That's wonderful. So tell us a little bit, how did you get here? I know we've discussed many times about your experience working at Samsung, and I think that's probably what I wanted to focus on mostly today. But yes, tell us a little bit about how did you get to your position in Samsung, what was before, and then we'll talk about your work there.
Great, great. Well, just you kind of went through my background a little bit, but I'll add a little bit of color maybe to it. I was with AT&T for about 20 years in variety of positions. One nice thing about a big company is you do have the opportunity to move between different jobs. So I was lucky enough to be in things like strategy and planning, merger and acquisition team, spent some time overseas analyzing potential companies we were buying. Got into product management, marketing, some sales work, and then ended up more of my time around product management. And my experience really covers things like infrastructure, things like fiber optics, central office switching, transmission, a lot of things that people don't really see. And then I ended up in the consumer products division of AT&T. So did that, ended up becoming an executive within the company. And from that was ended up recruiting by Samsung to come and start their mobile phone business in the United States. So I came to Dallas back in '97. And at that point in time, Samsung was a no-name brand. If anyone understood Samsung at that point in time, it was kind of known for crummy black and white TVs. And their whole mission was, how do we start to reposition the company in North America? And at that point in time, the wireless industry was going from something called analog to the first generation of digital technologies, something called CDMA and GSM technologies. So the real mission for me was to start a business and then position the brand really as a premium brand. So when I joined Samsung, a couple kind of funny stories with them. I kind of asked them what was their strategy and what were they going to do and how are they going to do it, and why they thought they're going to be a success. And when I talked to the executives, they said, well, we don't know exactly how we're going to do it, but we do know this is that we've been in semiconductors. We didn't know what we were doing, but at that point in time, they were the world's largest semiconductor company in the world. So I thought, well, that sounds pretty good to me. Then I asked the next question, what's your strategy for the US? How are you going to enter the market? And they kind of looked at me and said, well, we really don't know, but that's kind of why you're here. So I figured, oh, what a great opportunity. So I started with, when I joined it, there was about 5 people in the business. They did have a contract at that point in time with Sprint, but had not launched a product. I was there for about 11 years. I was really anything that was to do in the United States, so customer facing, so sales, marketing, product management, operations, those are all underneath my group. We ended up growing in from about 7 people to over 350 people in North America. And then we grew the business from, again, 0 revenue to over a $4 billion business during that point in time. So it was, let's put it this way, it was quite an adventure for me, going from not having a plan to being underneath a lot of pressure to come up with plans and all kinds of success stories for Samsung. So it's a great experience. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There, as I said, 11 years. And then I ended up going to a couple startups. One was a small cell phone repair company, 2 entrepreneurs, which a venture capital company put together, and they were looking for what I'll call it professional managers to come in and help shape the company. So I was responsible for account management, a nice way of kind of saying sales. Did that for about 1.5 years. And then one of my customers at that point in time, called e-recycling or Hyla Mobile, came up with an idea of buying people's cell phones and then reselling them overseas. So the idea is, in the United States, people would start trading their phones every year, 1.5 years, but the phones they would trade in generally were in good condition. They were still had value, residual value. So the idea was to sell them to overseas markets. And my job there was a little bit different. I was in charge of operations of the business. So it was basically picking the products up from our retail partners, which again were all the carriers in the United States. So people like Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, bringing them back to an operational facility, which we set up, and basically going through the grading process, fixing the products and getting them ready for sale overseas. So again, that business went from a concept or an idea that no one had ever really done in a mass market in the United States. In 4 years, we went from, again, 6 people sitting around a conference table to over a $750 million business. We actually had 70% of the buyback programs in the United States. So it was quite a success story. A lot of growing from trying to set something up to, once you go to a large scale, is how do you actually take it to the next level. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that happened there. But again, it was a great experience. So that's my general background on kind of where I got to where I am now. Obviously, we went from there. The company was sold, and now I'm off into the consulting world, kind of helping other companies either start or develop business plans and strategies for growth and success.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from your experience, right, this is exactly what you've been doing for a very long time, taking the company from zero, from an idea to something very successful. So I wonder, when you were offered that position at Samsung, how did you feel about it? Like,
good.
What interested you?
Right. No, great question. So this was really, since I had had a broad level of experiences at AT&T, it was really, and I'll probably say my background was much more analytical, strategy oriented. So when I was given the opportunity to say, here, go do something, come up with a plan and a strategy, that obviously piqued my interest. The thing that was maybe a little concerning for me at that point in time is Samsung had no experience in the US market in this industry at all. And again, as I said before, they really had no brand or brand recognition. So really the idea of starting something new, I'd started new ventures when I was at AT&T. Again, it was an opportunity to do it on a different scale and scope. The business really, we ran it as a venture. So we had a board of directors, we had some capitalization. Obviously, there is a lot of support behind us in Korea from both a manufacturing perspective and an R&D perspective, but really working with the customers, the different carrier customers, developing a product line strategy plan, and then obviously working with our headquarters group to make those things happen and then bring it into the United States. What was really kind of fun about the business is there was what I'll call a sell-in process to the US carriers and a sell-through process to consumers, raising consumer awareness. So for me, it was an opportunity to take all the experience I had and really put it together in a real, as I said, a commercialized environment with relatively little safety nets at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Funny part that I found at AT&T, when you had an issue or a question or a technology issue, well, there was Bell Laboratories. There's all kinds of smart people you can go and talk to. At Samsung, there was a lot of smart people, but they were kind of over in Korea. So the idea of, well, what do we do next, ended up becoming either myself or the senior team I put together to say, let's come up with the best strategy and plans, and then go work them. And as I said, we were, it was an exciting ride. It had its ups and downs. The thing that I will probably say that made it different is understanding the Korean culture. So I kind of told people it's kind of like living overseas but being at home, because half the day was really, or half your day was really geared on my U.S. customer. What do they want? What do we do? And then the second half of my day, which is typically from 6 o'clock on until 8 or 9 in the evening, was to work with our Korean counterparts, getting them to understand what we need and going forward. And that's, for me, since I had lived overseas once before, was kind of a unique experience, again, of trying to be clear in what you wanted. And because if you weren't clear, you weren't necessarily going to get the results you wanted. So as I said, it was a challenging environment. I have great respect for people in Samsung, but they run their business much, much differently than I'll say a typical US company would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I want to come back for a second to like the beginning, because it sounds like, you were given a great opportunity, but also tasked with a lot of responsibility to take this brand, right, and make it successful in this country. So how did you feel about that? Did you feel pressure, or was it all just fun and excitement?
Oh, great question. So let me kind of give you a little background. People probably won't remember all in 1997, but at that point in time, I had joined the company. We put together a little plan. We did our first couple months, we launched our first product, and it met with some good success. We happened to time the market pretty well in launching a product before Christmas for spring. So we did relatively well. It was hard at that point in time to get enough products in, because quite frankly, manufacturing was constrained. And at that point in time, Samsung could sell the same product in Korea for about double what was the going market price in the United States. So it was always a push-pull of trying to get enough supply. We got through our first 6, 7 months and developed a plan for the next year. That's the time that the Asian debt crisis happened. So essentially what happened is all foreign currencies, or particularly in Asia and Korea in particular, the countries went bankrupt. They were literally starving for US dollars. The company was in trouble. Korea was in trouble. A lot of countries and companies in Asia that melted down. And I said to myself, what the hell did I get myself involved in here? I was like, oh my gosh, I think about it's hard enough kind of selling to a customer. All of a sudden, we have this crisis that I don't really quite fully understand. I ended up getting a call that says, hey, we're going to have 3 or 4 executives are going to come to see you Monday, Pete. My boss told me. So, they came and they looked at me, and we had a modest plan for that year to kind of grow like 2 times in size. We had done about 100 million in our first 6 or 7 months. I had a plan for 250 million. And they looked at me when they came and said, Pete, what would it take to double that? And it was like, and starting when? Now, what do you, so quickly came up with some ideas, gave them ideas, and said, okay, here's how we can grow this to a $500 million business over the next year. They said, great, go do it. And it was just like that. And I didn't realize this, but actually the Asian crisis for me ended up becoming a huge benefit, because the country was starved for dollars, hard currency and cash. So actually the products I sold were more valuable at that point in time to Samsung, because it brought hard currency into the country. So out of kind of something that was a crisis for me ended up becoming a major benefit. I ended up getting a lot more manufacturing support, which we struggled the year prior, to all of a sudden having, like getting more and more. And it was always at the end of the month, how much more do you want? Can you sell more? Can you sell more? So pressure went from struggling to get products to all of a sudden, we have so much, go sell more, go sell more. So it was kind of the yin and yang kind of an experience in really the first 2 years of the business there. So again, it was an interesting time and environment while you're growing a business. Again, going from 7 people to 30 people to 50 people to 80 people, trying to bring in the right type of talent to grow the business, quite frankly.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the context, because it does sound like they were, I don't want to say desperate, but sounds like a little bit desperate to gain some success here, right? And perhaps that is why you were given the autonomy you were given as to, okay, this person must know what he's talking about. He has lived in this country, has worked in this country for many years, and has all of this experience. Let's trust him that he can take us there. They didn't really have a choice. So yes, tell me a little bit more about like the beginning and how all of your success unfolded. How did you take this company to become this multi-billion success story in this country?
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit more background and context, because it goes into, as you kind of mentioned before, about what kind of environment and pressure you're under. What Samsung has done, and when I worked at AT&T, AT&T did the same thing as trying to move internationally. And what a company typically does is they pick on somebody in the room. They say, "Oh, you're a good guy, and English. Let's send you to the United States." Or in AT&T, "Oh, well, you have a German last name. Let's send you to Germany," kind of thing, to do business there. So typically, most companies will send their expatriates out to different markets and to learn and understand. And Samsung had done that all of its career as well. And nothing wrong with it, very smart people. But the group I was part of was actually an experiment by the chairman's office in Samsung to say, you know what, instead of putting our trusted expatriates into those leading roles, let's hire some people who actually understand the business in that market, hire them, and let's give them the driver's seat. It wasn't necessarily the keys to the car, but at least the driver's seat to come up with a plan. So we were actually a test case of how to expand Samsung's business globally. So we were, best I can say, is underneath a microscope to make something successful happen and actually try to help globalize Samsung's business. So in addition to the fundamental challenges of just selling a product in the United States. And again, at that point in time, there was Motorola and Nokia. These were big companies, leading shares in the United States. The carriers viewed us, Samsung, as a cheap Korean manufacturer. So again, we're trying to change their perception to high-end quality brand company, a startup environment, and then kind of the added pressure of, hey, you are actually an incubator for how we want to look at our business going forward. So for me, I kind of understood all that. So it was a great responsibility. Took the job obviously very seriously, and quite frankly, worked incredibly hard to make things happen. Again, got a good team of people in the US. There was obviously a lot of cultural differences that made it even more complex at points in time. So again, those were some of the struggles. I'd like to actually give you another example of maybe environment and what made this different than just a regular old venture. Korean culture is a little different. So Korean culture, it's very much, you do it for the team. And if you don't succeed, it's personal shame on you letting the team down. And that was different. In the US, if you're doing well and, you have a success, everyone pats you on the back, right? And says, "Oh, great job, Pete, keep going," kind of a thing. In Korea, there wasn't necessarily a lot of accolades. It was more of, okay, how come you didn't do better? Like, okay, you sold that, but we should have sold more, or we should have sold it for a higher price. So it was always like, you've got to do better. And again, it's different for someone who's more American based, looking at the positive incentives to a different culture where the driver was actually more of, if you don't do this, you'll fail and you'll fail us. I'll just, if you wouldn't mind, I'll give you another kind of interesting story, just to again give you color. And it kind of goes into what was the environment around my job itself. We used to have these international executive meetings twice a year, and they would have the different subsidiaries from around the world show up in Korea, and there would be about 150 people, 200 people, and it was an auditorium that kind of went up from the very bottom kind of to the top. And the way they sat people in that was based on the performance of the previous year of how well the subsidiaries did. So if you're down front, that means you're doing really well. If you happen to be on the very top in the back of the room, basically you're not doing very well. And the next step for you, if you don't do well, is out the door. So it was a very obvious pecking order of where you sat and kind of where you were. 3-day meeting, all in Korean. You know, I was lucky enough to have my boss who was very good, who would interpret as we went along. And for a lot of it, it was financials. So the financials were pretty straightforward. Good things were in green, bad things were in red. So when you saw a financial sheet for someone come up and it was a lot of red, you know, there's gonna be a lot of questions. So we had a luncheon, you know, and a little bit of drinking, you know, and things. Okay, we come back to the conference room, and here is the CFO for the bigger Samsung, not just Samsung Electronics, but Samsung corporate. And it was Mr. Choi, I even remember that. So Mr. Choi was sitting there, a nice, big, long table in the auditorium with this green velvet with flowers and flags. And everyone comes in, you know, here comes this, you know, very, very high level executive. So we started off his conversation with, well, you know what? I was just told to come here and I didn't prepare anything. So do you have questions for me? And if you know anything about Korean culture, not a lot of people just jump up and start asking questions. Everyone's very quiet. And the room is quiet, and it's 3 minutes with not a word. And you can hear people shuffling in their seats, clearing their throats. And he said, oh, well, if there's no questions for me, I have questions for you. So Mr. So-and-so, and Mr. So-and-so would stand up and he would bow. And he said, would you mind telling the audience why you bought so much inventory at the end of the year, couldn't sell it, and decided to discount it by this amount, losing this amount of money? So of course, big shame, big apologies to everyone. And then he had to explain what he did. And of course, that was a learning experience where then the financial chairman would then talk about what he did wrong and why he did wrong. This went on for probably about 2.5 hours, calling on different people in the room. Most uncomfortable, and again, I wasn't called on, but probably the most uncomfortable period I can remember in my career of watching a room of 200 people squirming in their seats, hoping they didn't get called on. Because if you get called on, it wasn't for something good, it was something you did wrong at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the motivation talk for everyone. Let's put it that way.
Was there any kind of positive reinforcement?
Positive reinforcement, that's exactly it.
Was there any, or was that like the only motivational?
That was, well, I'll give you, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to give you one more story because they're different and unique. End of the year, again, same kind of meeting. They would have 500 executives from Korea and overseas, big room, all the different divisions. So semiconductors, telecommunications, home electronics, the display division group. And the chairman of the company would get up and he said, I'm going to give an award for the division that beat their plan. So Mr. So-and-so from semiconductors, oh, you beat your plan. And, you know, a lot of cheering. He comes down and they have this massive glass like obelisk that he's going to give him as a prize. So the chairman looked at him and he said, I noticed that you beat your plan by 30%. I mean, that's really good. But when I really think about it, obviously you didn't make a plan that was aggressive enough. in order to really actually get this recognition. But here you go. So it's kind of one of
Wow.
these backhanded, yes, you did great, but
But not.
clearly, but not. You didn't plan hard enough. You didn't give yourself a big enough goal if you beat it by that much. So again, cheering, yes, but it was kind of like, again, and I'm thinking about my time at AT&T. If anyone did that, it was like, what can we do? This is the best guy. But here was kind of a backhanded compliment. So again, it was just a different kind of a management approach. I always think about theory X and theory Y.
Yeah.
Theory X, we beat you until you, and theory Y, we praise you. So it was a different kind of environment. And again, it was just part of the psyche of the nation, psyche of how Samsung actually worked going forward. So for my team and myself, that was part of the environment you were on. And what I ended up doing when I kind of recognized that, I probably spent more of my time, and some of my senior leaders spent more of our time really working with the Korean team. And I'm not going to say that we kept the Korean team away from a lot of the workers in our group, but I knew that that kind of an approach would not be something Americans going, oh, this is great. I really love getting beat up every day. No, I really tried to let them do their job. And essentially, as I said, myself or senior management team taking more of the brunt and the burden of those kinds of discussions of you didn't do so well, how come you messed up, all those kind of things on ourselves.
Mm.
And again, and I understood it, but I will tell you, after 11 years, it becomes something that's very wearing, very tiring.
Yeah.
And, even though you did well, and I can still remember we had one year where we beat our plan by a lot. My marketing guy came in to me at the end of the year, and he was kind of like holding his head. And he said, we had the best year ever, but why do I feel so bad right now? I feel so depressed. And it was really kind of this environment and pressure that people were under. And for me, I understood it. I put myself in that position to, I'll say, shield as much as I could, so that people didn't get the brunt of the culture, that type of negative culture onto their day-to-day jobs. And
Mm.
obviously, at the end of the day, it was wearing on me physically and mentally, quite frankly. So,
Yeah, so I want to talk more about that, but before that, you brought up your experience working at AT&T as the opposite of that at working at Samsung. So how did either one of those affect your motivation and your desire to perform?
great. So AT&T, I don't want to say typical American company, but if you did well, accolades, right? There's awards, there's this, there's that. And the award ceremonies were, look at this shining example of this wonderful person doing really well. So it made you want to go forward.
Yeah.
Um, there was, again, same thing. I was in businesses that were failing, that were doing turnaround, but again, it was always focused on what can we do to succeed? What do you need to succeed, kind of a thing. So I will say generally there's more positive motivation. I was in a part of a couple business units that were not doing well, even under a negative environment. I'll probably tell you the motivation was still more on how do we turn this around? What can we do to get better? So there wasn't as much of a focus on your failures, but more on what can you do to succeed. So that was kind of more the AT&T version of it. Again, Samsung, even if you did well, I'll give you one more. Even if you did well, an executive would always come over and talk about another division around the world who did better than you. So you did really well. Well, yeah, you did well, but there's someone over here, they did so much better. So their motivation was, you've got to work harder. And that's just, and it's okay. I mean, I understood it. I also will tell you that the president of our division, Korean gentleman, great guys, probably 5 to 10 years older than me, had been in the United States for 2 tours of duty before. Um, he was probably in his mid 50s, late 50s at that point in time. Um, he was out of work a couple days. He came back in and he had like he was being monitored by the doctor, and he ended up having like a heart monitor. And I'd always remember like going in the mornings in particular, there'd always be a letter that would come over from Korea that would start saying, you need to do these things, respond to these things. And I would have to go to see my boss every morning, and he would go through painstakingly what was written, and I have to respond somehow. And I remember one morning going in and he started going through the letter. And of course, I'm telling him things. And then something would come up, and all I can remember was his heart monitor. I could hear it going off. And I'm thinking, okay, Jung Han, is you're having a heart attack here right now? So it was just give you an example of it physically impaired people. And I mean, it's funny because you can hear about it and talk about it, but out of the number of executives that I worked with, a number of them actually ended up having physical ailments, because of the pressure that they were under. Um, I can say that I was not part of the Korean political intrigue because I just didn't maybe understand it all. I mean, I understood it, but wasn't a little bit outside of it, where they're under tremendous pressure, which then obviously filtered down to my business. So again, it was different, just a different kind of result, as I said, at the end of the day, kind of a thing. So
Yeah. So I wonder how long, first of all, how long did it take you from when you started your position to recognize that pressure and that it's not working for you or for your team? And also in that process, what sustained you? Because you did end up growing the business and making it successful under all of that pressure. So in the process, what was sustaining you?
good question. So um, to start it, first off, the first couple of years is this idea of starting something new, bringing a team in, and gaining your first bits of success. We actually hit our first $1 billion at year 5. So that was a major milestone. I mean, hitting $1 billion in sales was, quite significant. So that was a great thing. Then we started really looking at what position. We're number 3, number 4 supplier in the US. We want to become the number 1 supplier. So that became kind of the next goal, which then, obviously gave the team, myself, additional motivation of what do we do next, kind of a thing. How can we achieve more? And then part of that was, let's look at our brand. We took the brand from nothing to something that actually created value, where consumers started coming in and asking for Samsung products.
Mm.
And by consumers asking for the products, we obviously created a better retail price, which in turn let us sell at a higher wholesale price into the carriers. So again, those were all great things that were happening. Each year we started growing the business by quite literally a half a billion a year. I can tell you another motivation. We signed the largest, at that point in time, the largest single contract that was ever signed in the mobile phone business. It was a 3-year, $3 billion deal with Sprint at that point in time. So getting those things, accomplishing those things, these were things that were really never done in the industry. That was a great motivator. So these were things that motivated myself. It motivated our senior team. And quite frankly, the team, even though they were pressured a lot of hours, weekends, when people were seeing success, it was a good thing, right? Everyone's very energized. Obviously, there are financial rewards that went with it, but I think the motivation were a lot of people who had worked at other companies were actually given the responsibility, given the wherewithal to succeed. And that was actually very, very thrilling. Okay. So kind of those are the kind of milestones. Some of the things that started changing. So I told you the first 5 years, every single decision was mine. Yes, I had to talk to headquarters, I had to tell them what we're doing, but they, quite frankly, I'm not gonna say they didn't know, but if it sounded okay and you got a result that was okay, as far as they were concerned. When we hit $1 billion, all of a sudden, you're actually a significant piece of business. A lot of people in Korea, first off, were resistant to the idea of having locals, in charge of businesses, because we actually took responsibility away from some of the Koreans and headquarters away. So there's a lot of resistance. And I'm going to say people were helpful, but it was kind of like you can hear them cheer, but you also know some people were looking for your failure as well because it meant their careers. But when we became $1 billion, obviously we knew what we were doing. All of a sudden, I got a lot of help. So I had
Well,
lots of help. I had all kinds of people help. I had lots of people come in, and so now my job was, I said, maybe 70% looking at the market, 30% internal. My job as a leader of the group probably came more like 30 or 40% external, 60% internal, because I had so many more handlers who had a better idea. You should do this, you should do this, you should do this kind of a thing. And again, not that ideas are bad, but some of it were things that may have worked in Russia or in Brazil, don't necessarily work in the United States. So you have to listen, take the ideas, and then do what you need to go do to be successful. But obviously, you have to respond back in kind, and it's not saying I'm not doing it. It's how do you kind of turn these things into a position to make people all feel good at the end of the day, like you're listening to them. So the help um, brought all kinds of scrutiny in. I mean, oh my goodness, hours upon hours, different groups coming in. I mean, I'll give you one other example, which is again, we decided we had an inventory system, right? So we do a sales planning process twice a week, where we kind of looked at projected sales, how much product should we tell the factory to build, and kind of have some numbers. The headquarters group decided, come in, and Samsung as a company decided to implement ASAP, right? So, or SAP, sorry, SAP. So we're going to implement this, and they had a highly trained group who work with SAP of inventory management and all the kind of different inventory systems. And SAP has got some wonderful, wonderful things. So I have a team of people are kind of doing orders and sending orders in. They're not MBAs, they're just regular people doing their job. And this team from headquarters came in and they showed the new SAP system. Here's how it's this, and that, the other. Different. People are trying to learn and understand it. So they kind of said, okay, here, you have the system now. Now we're going to measure you on 30 different attributes for your job. Okay. So did you get the inventory right? Did you hold it for so many days? Blah, 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 blah. So 30 different metrics. I mean, it was kind of mind blowing. I mean, I'm pretty educated. I had a hard time like grasping how many, and I have, order entry clerks, and they have now 30 things that they're looking at going, this is how you're going to be graded in your job on these. And then nothing wrong with the 30 metrics, but it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So in my view, it was a bit inappropriate. Like, let's start off a step at a time. Out of those 30 things, what are the things that are drivers? Well, there's only 5 things. So let's concentrate on those 5 things this year. Next year, we're going to add another 5 or 10 more. Well, again, I'm kind of looking at it very practically of trying to keep a business going. They're looking at it as a very metric-oriented business. Again, nothing wrong with it, but to the degree and detail that it really wasn't helpful. So again, trying to not demotivate my order entry team, to kind of give them something they can understand and do and grow with, rather than just throwing this big book at them and saying, go, you will. So again, how do I tell the headquarters team back off, and then also get people to kind of do something new, but do it in bite-sized pieces? That was a big controversy. So everything like that started being very hard. So, we kind of went from a small business to a big business with a lot of rules and regulations and lots of help. And so decisions where we made them before took longer. I had many more people to talk to at the end of the day, which is fine. But again, that's where I spent more of my day, rather on selling internally rather than externally. That added for me personally, well, I mean, I didn't mind doing some of that, but some of it was personal frustration. Um, one more story, if you don't mind, if it's okay to just kind of give you, we would have a meeting, let's say in T-Mobile on a Monday, right? We're going to have a meeting, we're going to bring some executives over, we're going to go through a product plan. So I'd have to go to Seattle to meet with the advanced team Saturday. So I'd go up there Saturday. We'd spend all Saturday going through the presentation, re-talking things, go out to dinner, Sunday all day. A couple of the executives would come in Sunday night, they wanted changes, all these things. Okay. We 2 days prep for the meeting, we'd have our meeting. Meeting was say 3 hours. And there is the Korean counterparts, a lot of them good English, but sometimes the understanding of the nuances of a language are different than just understanding the words. So we'd have a meeting, and whether it was good or bad, we would have a debrief. So we'd have a debrief that afternoon, and then we'd have a dinner, and it was usually a success dinner. Like whoever came over, who was the executive? Well, we did it really, really good. Look what I did. I came over and I helped do all this. Well, that wasn't exactly what the customer said. It was a good meeting, but the customer said this, that, and the other one. I would end up spending next Tuesday, all day that Tuesday, kind of helping them understand and reframe what was said and asked for, which is maybe a little bit different than what the person who came over thought. So for a half a day meeting for me, it was probably about 4 days worth of time beginning to end, either prep time and cleanup time. So we all walked out with a common understanding. So again, that's part of the environment you work in. So I don't have any problem with it. But again, the frustration level with that, and not just being able to do things to now really bring people along, which again is part of the job, that kind of added to pressure and frustration at the end of the day. And again, so that starts to get into, you're talking about burnout.
Well, 1 second, I want to summarize, right? What you just said, the things that what sounds like to me were kept you going for a long time was the autonomy, right? You had the autonomy to make your own decisions. You had challenging goals for yourself and your team, and meeting those challenging goals and getting excited about that, that's what moved you along. Another thing, I mean, I don't know, you probably had a different type of interactions and celebrations within your American team, right, than the interaction and celebrations that you had between like yourself, your senior leadership, and the Korean team. So that's one thing. And then later on, sounds like you had to do a lot of what we call like emotional labor, right? So not really being able to be honest about how you feel, what you want to do, but having to do a lot of this translation. Okay, how do I translate what I really think or feel to the other team on the Korean side so that they still feel okay,
right.
And positive.
Yeah, right.
And at the same time, you had to numb your feelings. So you weren't feeling okay, you weren't feeling positive. And besides, you also served as a buffer for your team, right? You were taking all of the pressure, and in order to keep your team motivated and maintain balance there, you were taking all the pressure on yourself. So I know that's, as you're mentioning now, it eventually led to burnout. So let's talk about that.
You want to talk about burnout? Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
If you didn't mind, I was going to mention one other funny story, which will give you an example of frustration, burnout. I would go to Korea 6, 7 times a year. And every time I went, I would make a presentation. I'd make a presentation to the international team, the product team, the manufacturing team. They were all separate. No one wanted to sit in the same room. So I had to do the same presentation 4 or 5 times. So I've been doing this for how many years, right? So I'm making a presentation, and some guy in the room raised his hand. He said, Mr. Skarzynski, April last year, you said this, but now you're saying this. How come? And I'm thinking to myself, April of last year. I mean, how many meetings, how much this, how much that? And talk about being under the microscope, they basically have transcripts of everything that was said, and they have people checking on what you said and where you changed. And of course, the only thing I can say is, well, market dynamics. But it kind of just gives you a sense of anything that you said at certain points in time were nitpicked by just about everybody.
Mhm.
Big frustration at the end of the day. I mean, what I said a year ago may not apply now. So yeah, big, as I said, big frustration. I'll tell you, I started noticing it on a couple meetings when or I was going back to Korea one time, and we're going through a difficult point in time. And this happened with a customer. Another competitor came in. In fact, actually, I think around a lot of it was around the iPhone. And I remember my boss looked at me and said, "Well, okay, what are you going to do against Apple?" And I'm thinking, I don't really know if I have an answer right now. And then you go to Korea and that's the same thing. Well, what are you going to do? How come you didn't do this? How come you didn't know that? And I'm thinking, you know, I'm kind of one guy, I have how many people, but I'm not the brain power, brain trust of the company. And there is at that point in time, lots of blame, lots of this, lots of that. And like any business, you're going to have ups and downs, but the down I mentioned before became no different than Mr. Choi sitting there having you stand up and asking you a question, how come? And you have to then fall on your sword. And that's, again, just not a normal thing to go do. You try to logic through it. But so those sort of things starting to get to a point of I started literally running out of physical and mental energy. And you get in that, you feel, well, okay, I just had a bad day. You try to figure out how to revive yourself. And I started noticing in the last probably 2 years of my time there, my I hate to use it these terms of mental fitness, where before answer, 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 idea, 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 to it was harder to, even if you had an idea, the process to sell that idea was so many more hurdles that that enthusiasm, that energy to go do it just became smaller and smaller over a period of time. So as I noticed myself, my mental and quite frankly, my physical abilities, I was traveling 70% of the time. So that's a lot of time in planes and on the road and everything. Nothing was not a non-pressure situation. It was always you're in front of a customer or you're in front of a financial in New York on Wall Street, talking about performance of the company. So there was a lot of you got to step up to things. And over time, uh, I think if there was support, that probably would have gotten through it. But the fact it was more of that negative support I talked about before, how come you didn't do, that actually ended up draining me, quite frankly, mentally and physically. I hate to kind of look back at it, but yeah, it was hard. I mean, not sleeping much, sleeping 3 hours a night, getting up in the middle of the night thinking what's happening the next day. What do I got to do? How do I start planning while you're laying in bed? Okay, I'm going to go back to sleep for an hour. After a while, you're not going to operate at your peak efficiency, quite frankly. And I'll tell you, I had started having physical stress. As I said, the energy that I had and just getting up and doing, I'd still do it, but it wasn't that, let me get up and do it. It's like, oh, okay, again, I have to talk about the same thing again and again and again. Before I had patience, now I lost my patience, quite frankly.
Yeah, it
And
sounds like, the only thing that was sustaining you before, the autonomy, the fun, right? It's like you see, once you stopped having that, like that's it, your only buffer between all the stress that you had on your job and yourself was gone.
it's gone. Well, another interesting thing about it, we were meeting, remember I told you about meeting goals? We were number 4 supplier, number 3 supplier, number 2 supplier. When I left the company, we were actually number 1 supplier of handsets in North America. We were at every single carrier. So as I go back to the goals, there were goals of dollar goals, there were goals in market positions, there were goals in brand goals. And I'm not going to say that we met everything, but for me, I was kind of doing the same thing for 11 years. I mean, we were growing and we got to, at the end of it, there wasn't, I'm not going to say that there wasn't the next level of opportunity. The next level of opportunity for me would have been to become a president of the operating division. I was senior vice president of sales and marketing. But the next thing would have said, okay, you're now president of the division. And Samsung wasn't ready to do that with a, a foreigner, quite frankly. My bosses changed. They brought a new guy in to be the president of the group. My last boss really was a supporter. So he helped me understand the politics, the situations in Korea, what to do, how to do it. So he was a great coach. The new guy came in and he was, I'm in charge now, we're going to do it my way. And he didn't necessarily know the market. So now this level of retraining or training a president who essentially wanted to take your job, because the mobile phone business was essentially 95% of the business of the subsidiary, the Samsung Telecommunications America. So for me, there was no career path. So, you know, financially we did well, position wise we did well. For me, there was just keep on doing the same. In fact, let me take some of those responsibilities away from you now. So that led to an incredible amount of frustration and kind of said, hey, your time is up. You know, yes, you did a great job. Yes, you took it from 0 to $4 billion. There isn't too many more things to do here. You're not going to get the recognition. The company was not ready to promote someone from a subsidiary. And then you just kind of added in, you're in the same circle, same circle, same circle. Yeah, it kind of led to burnout, frustration. And as I said, at the end of the day, physical and mental exhaustion is what it ended up coming out down to.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about what you mentioned, that like coming up with ideas or selling ideas was becoming more and more difficult. And I can totally see when, over a prolonged period of time, you are coming up and selling all of those successful ideas, but all that you get is shame. Eventually you're like, why? Why am I even doing this?
Yes.
And,
Yes.
speaking of your stories, and we just have a few minutes left. Speaking of your stories, can you tell me, I remember this pivotal point where you had to go on take time off from work because of the physical symptoms of your burnout. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Remember I told you new management came in, my new president came in. I worked with him for probably 6 or 9 months, but he was very Korean oriented, which means let's come, like we used to work weekends, right? But he would say, everyone come in on a Saturday and we're going to work. And he would do it in such a way that it would have the US people come in at 10 o'clock and leave at 4. So essentially family time away was non-existent. And for me, I became very sad because I made sure during the point in time, my group in the US, which included some Koreans, by the way, so it wasn't just Americans, there were Korean expatriates as well, people enjoyed. And all of a sudden, I could see not only was I getting depressed, but I was watching the team get depressed. And that probably for me was the thing that hurt the most emotionally and physically. So as we were going through that, I remember one day sitting in my chair and feeling like I was going to fall off my chair. We had a meeting, we're going to have a dinner, and I just told him, I don't feel well, I'm going to go home. I struggled driving the car home, believe it or not. I was like paranoid of driving. I got home and I probably look at it in hindsight, probably should have been hospitalized, quite frankly. What do you want to call it? A nervous breakdown, or didn't have a heart attack, but I literally, as was a point where I was not sleeping at all. So now I'm sleeping an hour a night. Literally laying awake. So really got into a very bad spot physically. Quite frankly, I lost not my ability to think, but my ability to talk. I could think thoughts, but I couldn't verbalize it. Part of my body, believe it or not, became partially paralyzed on one side. And I never would have thought that stress or any of this stuff would have manifested itself this way. but it was at a point in time where I kind of just said, my body kind of said, take a break, Pete, you're done. And from that, did the things you're going to go do, went and saw a doctor, see my physical doctor, and ended up talking to a therapist. And, they started listening to the stories and going through it. I ended up getting acupuncture, which was really an interesting experience because he talked about energy flow in the body, and what you were experiencing, your energy is blocked. So again, I was a little bit more primed to understanding Asian cultures and things, so I was very open to it. I was off from work, took a short-term disability for 3 months, 4 months. I also recognized, by the way, that was the end of the career there, because you don't really go on a disability. They're going to bring you back for a while, but they're most likely going to get rid of you. But I did take the time to try to reflect a little bit of how would you do things differently. Kind of went over, what did I do wrong? How could I have done better? Also took the time to physically and mentally come out of it. And it took some time. I'm going to quite frankly tell you, physically and mentally, I probably was not prepared for my next job about a year. So it was 4 months off at home and seeing doctors and walking and doing all these kind of things, gaining my own self-confidence back, quite frankly, because of that constant, you're not good enough. And then took another job, and I still talk with my therapist, saw him every once in a month, and after a while, it was every 2 months. And actually, the thing that dawned on me, maybe after 2 years or 2.5 years, he said to me, he said, Pete, he said, when you described your experience at Samsung, and he said, when I first met you, and he said, where you are now, he said to me, you had PTSD. And I'm thinking to myself, no, the only guys who had PTSD at that point in time were those guys going off to war, right? And there I could see it because it's physical and mental. And he said, no, that's exactly what it's about. He said, it changes how you think, work, and act. And he said to me, he said, you've recovered. I mean, you're back being a productive person. He said, quite frankly, Pete, when I met you, I never thought you'd go back to work ever again. When he said that to me, it was like, that was huge. I mean, it was actually, for me, it was actually a relief from, yes, I was better and feeling much better and much more mentally attuned and kind of back to my old self. But when a doctor kind of says that to you, you kind of look and saying, wow, how did I let this happen to me? Why did I do these things? How can I do it differently going forward? Quite frankly, I became more in tune afterwards of my physical and mental self in my next jobs. Again, had the energy, had the ideas, was kind of back to the old self, but I was a bit more attuned to when I knew I was getting to that point of fraying, of saying, I'm confused, I'll just take the burden, to really say, wait a second, sit back a minute and look at this differently, act differently, operate differently going forward. So, the couple startups I went to, I mean, different kind of pressure, it's a startup and it's this and that. There wasn't necessarily that negative influence that I
Yeah.
told you that the Korean culture put on it, but you still had pressure, like anything. But I was
I
much
just want to ask
more.
1 second, Pete. What did you start doing differently in terms of taking care of yourself? Like, how did you create the buffers now?
So yeah, obviously, I will tell you, I wasn't traveling as much. So remember before, I was traveling 60, 70%. So I wasn't traveling as much. I started physically taking better care of myself. So before, kind of in the 40s, 50s, it's like, oh, no problem, I'm a strong guy. Well, all of a sudden, given those 10 years, your body kind of, and late night drinking and big dinners, your body just doesn't hold up. So all of a sudden became one physically, take a better care of yourself. So got back into swimming. I'm a big swimmer. So got back into those kinds of things that actually provided a little bit different of an avenue to get rid of some of the either tension or build yourself back up again. From a business standpoint, I was probably more reflective. And I'll, in fact, give you another story. if you don't mind. We were
Well,
going
we
through,
actually don't have
we
time.
don't have time, okay. But if I kind of looked at it, it was being more reflective and how you addressed an issue and a problem, rather than just running with your hair on fire to saying, okay, how can I go solve this? Like in a logical approach at the end of the day. So it was slowing down, thinking, still working through it, but maybe not taking all that stress and putting it into yourself internally.
Mhm.
Made a major difference in my life, quite frankly.
Okay.
So
So how
I'm a
not,
well-mannered person now, just to let you know.
so now looking back, two questions. First, how do you define sustainable work?
Mhm.
And second, the question that you said you ask yourself, where did it go wrong? What would you do differently if you were to go through your journey of working at Samsung again?
Okay. So sustainable work. I mean, obviously everyone's going to talk about work-life balance. Um, Depending on positions, that's hard. And I will tell you, when I was at Samsung, the job really demanded, I mean, it was a 24-hour type job almost, maybe 18 hours a day type job. But I think part of it would be coming back to, as I said, slowing some of it down mentally and keeping a physical regime up was things that I learned and probably what I should have done better over a period of time. I think another one that I looked at was where I took a lot of that burden. I mentioned about Samsung taking a lot of the burden from the headquarters. I'm not saying I wanted to share it equally to people, but I probably should have let some of it go. Some of it should have just flowed off of my shoulders, and some of it really better, I'm not going to use the word better delegation of pressure, because I will tell you, my executive team was under pressure just like I was. But I think trying to offload some of that rather than just take it all on yourself as a burden.
Mm.
Those would be the things that I would probably say make it more sustainable for ourselves. Um, the last one I'm probably going to look at is I'm a relatively serious guy, so I kind of look at these challenges are life or death in many ways. I'll just tell you, I do take things very seriously. Probably taking it, and not saying that business isn't serious, but probably not making it a life or death situation for myself as much. Kind of putting business challenges into perspective. You will get the job done. You just don't have to go over it, kind of a thing. So those would be things I would probably change, or to make things more sustainable. That's some of the changes I would make. Um, you asked me a question about Samsung. How would I change it? First off, I wouldn't have changed not going to Samsung. For me, it was a life-changing situation. Loved the experience, loved the opportunities. I probably did so much more there than I would have ever at AT&T, quite frankly. Um, Again, probably putting some of the things I just mentioned into action earlier, through that process, and probably understanding some of my own self limitations, both physically and mentally. Those are things that I would probably tell people to reflect on, take some time, whether it's during the day or, at the end of the day. Um, I started something that worked for me is just breathing exercises. Believe it or not, like in the morning, I would just sit and breathe for a minute. At lunchtime, I would sit and breathe for a minute. Same thing. And end up finding that I could decompress myself. And I started actually doing it in business meetings. We'd start a meeting and everyone's all set. Is that just tell everyone to sit and we just start to breathe together, which is kind of a weird exercise at first.
Mhm.
But when you do it, you'll find out your blood pressure, energy is better, and actually you're clear of mind. So things like that I've learned over time that actually help me work more effectively, quite frankly.
Yeah. And it sounds like to me that ultimately work is not that like all important thing, right? There's so much focus on like work and achievement and getting somewhere where it's really doesn't get you where you think it will.
Ray, that's a really good one because I kind of look back and I've often reflected what even with probably with learnings and saying, if I turn the clock back and did it again, the opportunity and challenge, I probably still would have looked at all those goals and still driven to achieve them, because for me, that meant a lot. Probably how I got there would be a little bit different. So I'm not going to say that the achievement and this and that are not worthwhile, but maybe how I got there, I'd probably find a saner way of doing it, quite frankly, at the end of the day. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, and everyone's going to look at their own lives and saying, what drives and motivates you. I mean, I can tell you, I was given an opportunity that few people had have a chance to in life. I went for it, succeeded at it. Obviously, there's a consequence, a pretty big consequence. If I turn the clock back, I'd probably still look at it as a great opportunity and try to go to achieve it. Maybe my path to get there would be a little bit different. That would be a little bit more reflective.
Yeah, with more
Not saying I'm not going to
self-care,
achieve it,
more
but
self-care, right?
yes, but more self-care to involved with that process at the end of the day, quite frankly.
Well, thank you, Pete. It's been awesome as always. I mean, I can talk to you forever, as you know, proved by our long walks and discussions. But if people want to find you and perhaps work with you, how can they do that?
Sure, sure. So I have my business is called Sounding Board Strategy. So you can email me at soundingboardstrategy at Gmail, or you can give me a call. Text is better. My number is 972-365-7365.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Mary. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Pete. I really appreciate your contribution.
All right.
We'll take
Thank you.
care. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow at Sustainable Work.